Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And so, almost seamlessly to the man himself, I'm now joined by the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. This big victory of yours clearly changes things for the Labour Party. What is the major thing that it changes?
Well, I've been elected by a very substantial majority of the membership, supporters and affiliates. I think that is an indication that the members want our party to challenge the government on austerity and change to go in the direction of saying we want a more equal and decent society in Britain, and that's what we're going to campaign on. So I started yesterday by announcing we're going to do an education campaigning day next Saturday about grammar schools and 11+.
You said to the Observer newspaper yesterday that because of this huge membership, this has to be reflected much more in decision-making in the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party has a pretty Byzantine, complicated and largely behind closed doors way of making policy at the moment. Are you saying then that you'd like the big decisions to be taken by an open vote of the mass membership?
It's a very good description of the way things have often been done in the Labour Party, if I may say so. What I want is a more open party, and we need to look at democracy and involvement of members in and supporters in all aspects of party decision-making. So I have asked the National Executive to look at the ways that we democratise in bringing more members into decision-making, policy-making coming from the grassroots, and greater trade union membership involvement in it, because there's a lot of thirst for change out there. People want to see things done differently.
So if somebody watching has joined the party relatively recently, supported you, is part of this big new mass membership, they might want to direct say themselves through their local party in, I don't know, policy over Trident or nationalisation, whatever it might be. Are you saying that you agree those people should have a bigger voice?
What I want is more power for members, more power for supporters, in order to ensure that we get policies that do have support throughout the whole party. Now, look, take, for example, anti-austerity strategy. Yes, we're opposed to what the government's overall economic strategy is, but it's also a question of what you invest in, how you invest in it, which railways you upgrade, which roads you change, which broadband you bring in, which new industries you support. And there's a whole lot of skill sets out there that we need to utilise.
OK, just going back to the original point, will those members get big majority voting in those big decisions? If you're a new Labour Party member, will you get a vote in the decisions of the Labour Party?
You, of course, will through your local party. I would like to take that in a way that people can participate much more online policy development, much more online consultation as well. So we have a sort of real-time discussions.
Big, exciting party conferences where there are votes on the floor and we don't quite know how they're going to go. I dimly remember those from the past, but we haven't seen them for a very long time.
You were excited by them, weren't you?
I enjoyed them hugely. I'm a journalist, of course.
Yes, the party conference, I think, needs to move much more to the centre of concluding our policy debates, and people can then see what discussions we're having, and I think that's actually a healthy thing to do. Now, surely a conference ought to be representative of members and their views.
Sure, you've had a great success inside the party, but it's as nothing to the challenge of becoming Prime Minister. If you want to be a successful socialist Prime Minister in this country, you can't do that unless you have a parliamentary party at your back who supports you. I know there's lots of argument now about deselection, what that means and doesn't mean, but in the end, doesn't that mass membership with their views deserve to be represented properly in the House of Commons? And don't you, if you're ever going to be a socialist Prime Minister, need to have the support at your back that you don't have now?
I'm reaching out to all our MPs, having lots of discussions with them, very talented people we have. There are some differences of policy opinion, yes, but there are also there's a great deal of unanimity about it. Look at the campaign we're mounting on selection and education. Look at the campaign on NHS, on workplace benefits. All those issues, actually the party's quite united.
Well, they walked out of your shadow cabinet, and then there was a very vituperative leadership campaign. Terrible things were said on all sides. People said awful things about you.
Really?
Oh, they certainly did. I've got a list of them, but I won't read them out.
You've only got half an hour on the programme.
I've only got half an hour on the programme, but people like Tristram Hunt and others, they surely now have to shut up. They can't carry on saying the kind of things about you and your leadership and your general uselessness, which is the word they use when they're being polite, now that you have won a second leadership campaign.
Well, the big advantage in this is that I've never said anything personal about any of them. And I don't use that kind of language, and I don't think anybody else should either. And so, let's move on. Let's move on, and that's exactly what I said in my welcoming speech yesterday.
Move on, but keep your lips a little bit tighter.
Move on and discuss policies where you agree or disagree. Put your contribution into that policy debate. Put your contribution into what we do in Parliament, into representing the people that have sent us there. Put your contribution in to making our party and our movement stronger. We have a massive membership. That surely is something everyone should be pleased about.
You've rather dismissed in the past the idea of deselections of MPs going on around the country, but there are two things I need to ask you about. One, it is already happening. There are places, Wallasey near here, down in Hove, there are moves to remove, as it were, Blairite or centrist MPs or candidates or people who are perceived to be that. Is your message to CLPs, don't do that? That is actually perpetuating the divisions and the fight that's already started.
My message is concentrate on policies, concentrate on campaigning, concentrate on getting out there and what we've got to put across as a message. My message to our MPs and parties is make sure that you agree on those policies and get out there and do it. But I have to say this, that we are going through, unfortunately, a boundary change. Every constituency boundary is going to be changed. 2 million voters will be unrepresented in the new... They will have votes, but they won't be represented in the calculations for the new constituency boundary, so they're very unfair. And therefore, a new selection will have to take place in every single constituency, where the sitting MP with a substantial geographical coverage to the new area will automatically be shortlisted.
Do you want to see most of those MPs reinstated as Labour candidates, or would you like to see a Labour Party after this process that is more representative of your kind of politics?
Listen, I wish them well. The relationship between an MP and their constituency is a complex one. It's not necessarily all the policy tick-boxing exercise. It's also the relationship to the community, the effectiveness of representation and all those issues. Let's have a democratic discussion, and I think the vast majority of MPs will have no problem whatsoever.
Let me put to you something that Lord Mitchell, who has just resigned from the party in the Lords, has said today. He said, first of all, that he has to go because he thinks momentum, Corbyn's people, he says, have the Labour Party by the throat, is his expression. But he then goes on to say something quite disturbing.
Has Lord Mitchell ever met anyone in Momentum? Has he ever spoken to anyone in Momentum?
I haven't asked him, I have to confess. But he also says this. He also says this, and this goes back to, I know, issues in the past. He said, I think it's very difficult if you're Jewish and you support Israel to be a member of the Labour Party. That's disturbing that he thinks that, isn't it?
It's unfortunate he would say that, because it's not a fair comment. And I would hope that he would reflect on that, because clearly there are diverse views within the party on issues in the Middle East, but there's absolute unity in the party of opposing any form of anti-Semitism, any form of racism in the party. That is very clear.
Let me move on to big policy issues. You said there were two areas particularly that you singled out you wanted to take to the Tories. One is Brexit and one is the economy and austerity. Let me ask about both of those. When it comes to Brexit, do you accept that all of those people, many of those people who voted to leave the EU, did so because they were worried about the scale of migration? Boris Johnson was saying that this country has been mainlining on too much migration for too long, and that therefore there has to be a cut in the number of migrants coming into this country.
It's quite hard to keep up with Boris Johnson's changes of opinion, actually.
Yeah.
And so that's the latest opinion of Boris Johnson.
That is the latest opinion, but nonetheless, I stick with my question. Free movement of people, does that have to end, in your view?
I think if we have a market arrangement with Europe, then there's going to be a demand by Europe that's absolutely clear, particularly by Germany, saying that has to include the rights of people to work in different parts of the European Union and Britain, which will then, of course, be outside the European Union, but part of the market. There is also the question of British people working in Europe, and 2 million British people who've made their homes in Europe as well.
But this is
if I just conclude the point, the other issue, which is the one that caused the most concern, is the undercutting of wages and conditions and the impact of migration on some communities. So a migrant impact fund to deal with that, but also the question of the undercutting of wages by bringing people in on lower than local wages, destroying local conditions. So, for example, in Lincolnshire there is an average wage rate just considerably lower than the rest of the country, and that applies in many other places.
That infuriates a lot of people, many of whom are Labour voters all around the country. But can I return to the basic question is going to be, and this is an argument inside the government too, about hard Brexit or soft Brexit. In other words, do we accept we don't have access to those markets and we have a real turn of the tap off on immigration? We have the end to free movement. At some point, you're going to have to say, yes, I accept there has to be an end to free movement, or no, I don't accept that, and I'm going to argue in favour of free movement. So which is it?
If you go for hard Brexit, which there are some elements the government want to, then there is a huge hit going to be taken on manufacturing industry in Britain, because the European market, which they rely on extensively, 70% of British exports go to Europe, are going to be hit very, very badly. And if their vision is of Britain of a sort of a tax haven offshore island from Europe with great levels of inequality and a loss of most manufacturing industries, I'm not sure that's something that's very appetizing to most people in this country. They want a deal with Europe. They want a deal with Europe which does protect those markets, which does ensure there isn't this undercutting process, that there is some equality across Europe. And I've been trying to reach out on this.
Hard Brexit?
Yes, and I have been reaching out by meeting members of the Party of European Socialists, many of whom are in government all across Europe, so we have some kind of agreement on what sort of future economic relationship we have with Europe. It's the key question. If we don't have an economic relationship with Europe, where are the new trade arrangements? Britain hasn't negotiated a trade treaty for 40 years.
Can I ask you about the other big controversy at the moment in this area, which is that ministers have said that Parliament is not going to be told how those negotiations are going, none of the detail, until it's all over and the deal is done. Do you think that is democratic and sustainable?
No, I don't think it's democratic, and I don't think it's sustainable at all. This is a huge political issue. It's the most significant economic issue facing Britain in my or your lifetime, and I think at the very least Parliament should be fully informed and told. So we've set up a Brexit team led by Emily Thornberry, our Shadow Foreign Secretary, that is meeting obviously regularly here, is demanding information and all that from the government, but is also meeting in Brussels, meeting our colleagues all across Europe, and I've invited leaders of socialist parties and trade unions and others from all over Europe to come to London later this year to have a full conference on how we will work with them to ensure that we accept the result of the referendum, we understand the result of the referendum, but we build a strong economic relationship with Europe in the future. That surely is what a responsible opposition should do. It's a shame the government can't do the same.
Let's carry on talking about the economy then. At the heart of your economic proposals post-austerity is a £500 billion infusion into the British economy.
Yeah.
That is an eye-watering sum. To give people a sense, it's about 70% of everything that government spends in this country in 1 year. So it's a huge...
It wouldn't all be done in 1 year, of course.
Of course, but it's a huge increase in borrowing. Now, I know interest rates are low at the moment, but they go up as well as down. Have you any calculations on how much British taxpayers are going to have to spend in interest rates if you do this?
It will be an investment that brings in greater tax income, because you grow the economy, you get greater tax income. We've had 6 years now of austerity in Britain, and we've had 6 years of austerity that has reduced wages, reduced living standards for many people, cut public services in many places, and has not resulted in the economic growth that the government predicted. We're saying invest in order to grow.
How did you come up with 500 billion?
A calculation based on the rough needs. It's obviously an approximation when you get to...
It's not just a nice round figure.
It's not a nice round figure, but
it is a nice round figure.
Well, it's a nice round figure, but shared out across the whole country. It gives you the infrastructure you need on railways, gives the infrastructure you need on broadband, gives you the investment you need in developing high-tech, sustainable industries in Britain, which this government is patently not doing. We're losing our inventions elsewhere because we don't have a banking system that's prepared to invest in them.
Now, this is very much the kind of language that was used by previous Labour governments, funding the NHS and all sorts of parts of the infrastructure system for a long period of time. And we know how that ended. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown poured money into the British economy, and then came the crash, and the British people decided they could not be trusted because they had spent too much. Their instincts were still borrow and borrow and borrow. And here you are coming back saying much the same thing.
The crash was not caused by government investment in services in Britain. It was not caused by...
The Labour Party was punished for it.
Well, it was not caused by the number of nurses or teachers we have in Britain. It was caused by a deregulated banking system that was investing in subprime mortgages in the USA, and there was a contagion because of it. Since then, the banking regulation does require them to have sufficient capital assets to protect them against that, and there's much tougher regulation on the banking system. Maybe it should be even tougher. There's a good case for that, but it was not government expenditure that caused the crash.
The mess this country is in, it is not all because of Labour. Of course, they must take some of the blame. All right, actually, they should take really quite a lot of the blame. In fact, let me just get this off my chest. They left us with massive debts, the highest deficit, the country's debt crisis created by Labour. Borrow more money. Borrow, borrow, borrow. This wasn't a normal recession. It was a debt crisis. The deficit left to us by Labour was one of the highest in the world. We're here because we spent too much and borrowed too much. The only way out of a debt crisis is to deal with your debts. And you know what? They say that madness is doing the same thing over and over again, but we still haven't finished paying for Labour's debt crisis. Paid off all of Labour's deficit, not just some of it. How did they get us into this mess? Too much spending, too much borrowing, too much debt. The crisis they created, clearing up the mess we were left. You are the people who left Britain with the biggest peacetime deficit in history. It is the same old Labour. And Labour, we will never let you forget it.
Six years after the financial crisis hit the world economy, tighter rules are being proposed to prevent the big banks from ever being bailed out by the taxpayers again. The Governor of the Bank of England, Marr, told a meeting of regulators in Switzerland today that the plans are a watershed moment and will force banks to hold substantially more capital. He's been speaking exclusively to our business editor, Kamal Ahmed.
2008, the year when the global economy teetered on the brink of collapse. Markets were in turmoil. Banks like Lehman's and the Royal Bank of Scotland were going bust, and it was left to the taxpayer to pay out billions of pounds in subsidies to banks that were just too big to fail. Today, the Governor of the Bank of England announced new global rules to make banks safer. He told me taxpayer bailouts would become a thing of the past.
Let's face it, the system we've had up until now has been totally unfair. The banks and their shareholders and their creditors, those big institutions that hold their debt, got the benefit when things went well, but when things went wrong, the British public, you and I, and subsequent generations have picked up the bill.
Events today at this drab and admittedly rather wet building in Basel, Switzerland might seem an awful long way from the real needs of the UK economy. But of course, it was only because the taxpayer was forced to spend billions of pounds bailing out the banks in 2008 that the government is today carrying huge levels of public debt. It was only because the taxpayer was forced to spend billions of pounds bailing out the banks in 2008 that the government is today carrying huge levels of public debt. Of course, what's followed are spending cuts which have affected everybody.
And I think there are some big lessons there, but they're not easy ones to implement, which is why I don't think we've really yet got to the heart of what went wrong. We've made the banking system safer, that is true, but is it really safe enough? Will it be... would we survive another big financial crisis that could yet come?
And you don't think the answer is we certainly would?
I don't think we're yet at the point where we can be confident that the banking system will be entirely safe. And I don't think any one country can handle this problem on its own. So that's still a big issue.
Can I just chip in on the politics of this? Because you say there's no point in blaming. It's over now, and in economic terms, one can see you want to move on, you want to address yourself in the next problem. But it's the context, isn't it, of the next election, actually, or one of the important parts of the context is going to be, can you legitimately say Labour were, to an extent, responsible for what happened, or is that an illegitimate thing to say? So on a sort of percentage from 0 to 100%, where would you place Labour's culpability? I'm
not going to talk about individual parties' culpability, because I think the real problem was that a shared intellectual view right across the entire political spectrum and shared throughout financial markets that things were going pretty well. Now, there were obvious imbalances. We knew the position was unsustainable, but it wasn't entirely obvious where it would come unstuck. And I think that's something that everyone shared, and I think the right thing to do now is to say, well, how can we make it better for the future?
For whatever reason, the idea is deeply rooted in British voters that Labour governments borrow and spend too much. Are you not taking a huge political risk by doubling down, as the Americans were saying, on that?
Invest to grow, invest in housing. Put it this way, we're spending £9.5 billion every year, £9.5 billion, get that figure, on subsidising the private housing market, on the private rented sector, through housing benefit payments to tenants who have a right to access those benefits. If those people were in social housing, council housing, the cost would be infinitesimal compared to £9.5 billion, and we would have that money to invest in building houses, which in turn creates jobs all down the supply chain. Isn't that a sort of virtuous circle?
Can I ask you a slightly philosophical question about capitalism? Two different views of capitalism on the left, generally. One is that this is a source of great dynamism, entrepreneurialism, creates big ideas, creates wealth. It also creates inequality and waste, and a social democratic government has to deal with the inequality and clear up the waste, but basically celebrates capitalism. And the other view is actually no, capitalism is a system driven by greed and individualism, hugely destructive, and in the end we want to replace it with a socialist system. Which side are you on?
Well, you put it in a very stark way. I think there has to be a mixed economy. I do think there is a huge role for the public in running public services, obviously, like the NHS, instead of privatising them. I do think there's a very important role for the state in investment in industry to ensure we have a strong manufacturing base, as Scandinavian countries and Germany does. I want to see a system where we produce what we need for people that need it, rather than the greed of those who don't need it.
In the old days on Merseyside, there was lots of talk
out
here of nationalising the top 100 monopolies. You'll remember it well. Is that old
170,
politics?
I think.
170. Are you still up for that?
No, I'm not up for that. I never was up for that, actually. What I do think is that we have to have public control over key services, health, education, transport, that we have to have a government that's prepared to invest in the economy and participate in it, in the way that successful manufacturing economies do have a role for the state in developing manufacturing industry.
Let me ask you
it's not a bad word.
You have used the word nationalise the NHS properly. You'd like to see the NHS properly nationalised. Yes. Now, does that mean that those private companies, which, take an example at random, are doing glaucoma operations more cheaply and more effectively and faster than the current NHS can manage, should be banned? Why should the NHS stop buying those services?
I think the NHS is better served if it does the services itself in-house. And
always?
Well, if you and I have obviously used the NHS. In fact, probably every viewer on this programme has used the NHS. And we also recognise the dedication of those staff. When you bring in a barrier between a local hospital and a contracting company to do some services, it actually often ends up more expensive.
Right at the beginning of the...
We have an NHS dominated by a culture of contracting out services.
We only have an NHS because Nye Bevan did a series of very important deals to found it, of which the most controversial was allowing British doctors who are against the NHS to carry on doing private business. Now, there's a proposal at the moment that the money that they earn from private work should be published, and that's controversial. But would you go further? Would you say British doctors working inside the NHS should not be moonlighting doing private work as well?
Most of them actually only do NHS work. Actually, the vast majority of GPs don't do any private work, and in many cases, their surgeries are actually owned by the NHS. Their buildings are owned by the NHS, and they are contracted to the NHS. And indeed, in many places, there are actually salaried GPs working. I tell you what, a lot of salaried GPs tell me they prefer it that way.
So that's not an answer to the question.
No,
however, is it?
It's not an absolute on it, because I want to see an NHS that does provide for all, and obviously you have discussions with the doctors and how they go about doing things, but I tell you this, the dedication of the junior doctors and others shows just how determined they are to save and support the NHS.
Quite a lot of people who would agree with you about that and about some of your economic ideas are nevertheless worried about your ideas on defence. You want there to be a Minister for Disarmament in the Cabinet and a Peace Minister as well.
The same thing, actually.
Same thing. So this Peace and Disarmament Minister, if you were Prime Minister and what the terrible things going on in Aleppo were carried out under your watch, would you be sending a Peace Minister to Aleppo? Would they be talking to the Russians? What would this Peace Minister be doing?
I'd be totally engaged with trying to bring about urgently a ceasefire, and I recognise this recent ceasefire has collapsed, and that is tragic beyond belief. I would have engaged with the Geneva talks from the very beginning, engaged with Iran, Saudi Arabia and everybody from the very beginning on this to try and bring about political settlement. Look, the lessons of Iraq, the lessons of Libya, Chilcot and the Select Committee report on Libya indicate that we haven't done things as well as we might. There has to be a political engagement. There has to be an engagement which deals with the issues at source for a political solution.
Mostly, when I ask you a sentence beginning, do you agree with Tony Blair, I know the answer. But in this case, I wonder whether you agree with Tony Blair when he said this weekend that he agrees that the prosecutions and the criminal investigations against British troops in Iraq and Afghanistan are unfair and have put too much pressure on people who went out there under difficult circumstances, and he's agreed with David Cameron, Theresa May and others that this should be stopped.
I have spoken to a number of soldiers that have served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I recognise the awful conditions that they were asked to serve under and the difficulties they had with that. But I do think there has to be a recognition that we've signed up for international law on the behaviour of troops. America going through the same experience, as do other European countries, even though they're not signed up to the International Criminal Court. So I think there has to be investigation. Saying never to prosecute, I think, would be a step too far.
Absolutely. Talking about terrible things that happen in war, I was discussing with Boris Johnson this attack by the Russians on a UN aid convoy, 20 people killed, aid workers completely innocent. Was that a war crime?
It sounds awfully like it to me. Absolutely terrible what happened there, because the aid convoy was there because there had been an agreement on it. It was there because we were moving towards a ceasefire which would bring about some relief to those people going through such a terrible situation, and it's unthinkable what they did on this. So, but there's also, of course, the question of playing our part in trying to help the refugees from Syria, and not just leaving them in camps, but actually trying to make sure we bring about a political settlement to allow return, but also we don't leave people stuck in camps for years on end.
Do you think the defence budget should be higher or lower than it is at the moment?
I don't think it should be any higher. I think it should be efficiently used, but I also think the defence budget should also be used where necessary, so that Britain is very good at actually giving aid and comfort during emergencies. Look at what we did during the Ebola crisis and other things. Sure. I think the defence establishment can be quite helpful in that sort of area. And I listened to what Clive Lewis has to say about that this week.
Looking ahead, you've said in the past that you would think the defence budget should be lower, and the reason I ask that is, putting Trident to one side completely, a lot of military people in this country say that we are simply not well prepared for any kind of future threat in Russia or anywhere else. We need to spend more on conventional forces, tanks, soldiers and all the rest of it.
I think the issues are of cyber security. The issues are of terrorism and security that goes with that, and random attacks, and that is not the same thing necessarily as having huge land-based defence forces. I do think you have to look at what security is about, but you have to look at it in the terms also of the political objectives you face or deal with all around the world to try to bring about political solutions to what look like intractable problems. We've been through a period of putting a lot of money and a lot of troops in a very dangerous place, and we've lost a lot of troops as a result of that. I think we need to reflect on that.
Do you support the increase in size of MI6 at the moment?
I don't necessarily think that's particularly necessary. I think there has to be obviously security for everybody, but I'm unclear as to why they want to be so much bigger.
One final tax and spending question, if you like. You've talked about paying for getting rid of tuition fees by raising corporation tax. Given where is it now, and where should it go to pay for that?
The corporation tax is amongst the lowest of the OECD countries. It's much lower actually in the United States. I think it should go up to the sort of 20% area that it was at before.
But it's 20% now.
No, I mean, they're putting it down. The government's plan is to reduce it.
They want to bring it down to about 17, so it stays at 20%, but it should go higher?
Not much higher, but I do think we have to recognise that we are well behind the curve of most European countries on the way that we treat our students in higher and further education, the fact that we leave students in massive debt, and the fact for the first time this year, for many, many years, the number of working class youngsters going to university is beginning to reduce. We're turning our universities in the direction of the elite rather than the direction of everybody. That, to me, is not just sad, it's wrong and unnecessary and wasteful. careful.
We all remember the dramatic overnight phone calls with Hilary Benn and what followed. Would you like to see Hilary Benn back in your shadow cabinet?
He wants to become the chair of the Select Committee on Brexit.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for talking us, Jeremy Corbyn.